The Gulf Injustice Podcast, the official podcast of Detained in Dubai with Radha Stirling.
Welcome to the Gulf Injustice Podcast. I'm Radha Stirling, and today we're asking the question, could Israelis who have been sold the elusive Dubai dream be walking into a nightmare?
After 49 years, Israel and the United Arab Emirates will fully normalize their diplomatic relations. They will exchange embassies and ambassadors and begin cooperation across the board and on a broad range of areas, including tourism, education, healthcare, trade, and security. This is a truly historic moment. Not since the Israel-Jordan peace treaty was signed more than 25 years ago has so much progress been made towards peace in the Middle East. By uniting two of America's closest and most capable partners in the region, something which said could not be done, this deal is a significant step towards building a more peaceful, secure, and prosperous Middle East.
And there you go, that's amazing stuff right there. Peace deals that nobody thought was possible. At least not for the foreseeable future in any case. Yet here we are, and the climate in the Gulf has been forever changed. But the normalisation of diplomatic relations between the two countries, between the UAE and Israel, has been touted as a great stride towards peace in the Middle East. While Israel and the Emirates have had an informal, cooperative relationship for many years, the official establishment of diplomatic ties certainly goes a long way to spread regional acceptance of Israel, which should help ease tensions. But the UAE immediately embarked upon fresh campaigns directed at Israeli investors and businesses, hoping to entice entrepreneurs to expand their activities into the untapped Middle Eastern economy. And the Israeli commerce sector is equally excited for reciprocal trade and commerce, looking forward to openly accepting Arab investors into local activities. And Israeli banks and financial institutions are excited to work with banks in the Emirates. And according to senior vice president of the bank, Hapoalim, are already in discussions.
So how do you characterize this normalization? These agreements is different than the other ones that Israel has experienced.
I think there's something very different about it in the fact that it is laying foundations that are economic foundations. I think the economic opportunity between these two nations is amazing. It's immense.
A very enthusiastic Karen Mazza there, but I wonder, does Karen know about the UAE's long and sinister history, and that Israeli banks or foreign banks who partner with them may end up actually sharing in that same reputational damage as the UAE arm steals foreign investment, steals land, jails customers or reports them to Interpol? On the other hand, the normalisation of dealings may force UAE banks to rise to international standards of process, although if we look at history, that's unlikely, given their partnerships with HSBC, Citibank and Barclays didn't change them at all, but in fact those international banks suffered great reputational damage all over the world. But in reality, both scenarios are likely to run contemporaneously as they struggle to merge ideas and practices. Ultimately, I expect things will improve, but not without teething issues that'll last for years, perhaps decades. But Israelis are likely to feel a sense of confidence to deal with banks, especially with a push from their own country. And this confidence and hope is likely to overshadow any doubt or fear. And like many before them, they'll only find out about the threats of investing in the UAE when it's too late. And that's a very unfortunate situation. And this is why we lobby so hard for foreign governments to really warn citizens before they arrive in the UAE of those very real risks. I founded Detained in Dubai in 2008 and have quite literally seen thousands of terrifying actions and campaigns against investors and entrepreneurs who are the most vulnerable people in the UAE. The Israeli media is only beginning their investigations into endless abuses against foreigners, and few are going to pay attention to what they perceive as negative in the face of more uplifting events like the UAE-Israel Digital Economy Summit, which took place this month.
As far as business is concerned, and that's what makes the Emirates so special, because it's very much business oriented, and that is something that we appreciate very much.
Now that AP report pretty much sums it up. Israelis flocked to the Dubai World Trade Center hoping to do business with Emiratis, summed up nicely by Joseph Dov Cohen of Kramer Electronics, who said, "Now there's a big opportunity for Israel and it's a big opportunity for them. It's amazing, it's a win-win, it's great." And then Michael Adman, the director of high-tech department at Israel Export Institute, agreed that the timing of the normalization deal has really helped. It's not an issue here as far as business is concerned, he said, and that is what makes the Emirates so special, because it's very much business-oriented. And the devastating effects of COVID lockdowns throughout the world has made both countries even more eager to explore. And as Cohen said, this couldn't have come at a better time. The issue comes, though, when mutual enthusiasm overshadows due diligence and risk assessment. Individuals and businesses can end up severely damaged with huge financial losses. And in the UAE, quite commonly, mistakes can lead to jail for the officers of the companies. Now, Israelis have simply not experienced this yet, but it's inevitable that they will.
We have to unite our vision and work together in order to be able to be successful if we really want to take it as a serious marathon run. I know that we have to go through many steps. We have to take the baby steps. And as Israelis, we are just like the Ferraris. 0 to 100 in 3 seconds.
Now, these thoughts are really nothing new about respecting cultures and so on. This is not new ground. It's new ground for Israel, but it's not new ground for other cultures, Western nations, the Brits, the Americans. The Brits have been in alliance with the UAE for decades, but the UAE is still the most likely place for British nationals to run into legal trouble abroad. And we're not talking about Brits who have committed serious crimes or have been offensive, ungracious or disrespectful. We're talking specifically about those Brits, whether tourists, expats or investors, who've been abused by Emiratis or the Emirati system. We're talking about rape victims who were jailed for sex outside marriage. Another example is Scott Richards, a British Australian national, for supporting a charity on Facebook. And he's not the only one. Lala Sharavesh, British, for calling someone horseface from outside of the jurisdiction of the UAE. Now, do Israelis even know that the UAE has extraterritorial laws related to social media? For example, if anyone in Israel has said something negative about the UAE or something that the UAE deems negative or offensive, even if they said it in Israel, and even if they said it 5 years ago in Israel, if they travel to the UAE, they can still be prosecuted for what they've said outside of the UAE on Facebook. This is an amazing situation. And people don't quite comprehend that these laws are actually used, and we have a precedent, and that is Lala Sharavesh. Those who have become indebted to a bank through no fault of their own. There's another example, criminalised by a system designed to give banks a jail card to hold over struggling foreigners. Perhaps they've lost their job, they've been made redundant, and they can face jail. The UAE is a country that foreign courts have recognised as too risky to extradite alleged criminals to because of the real risk of discrimination, unfair trials, forced confessions, arbitrary detention, human rights violations and torture. And these are all documented precedents that you can find in the British High Court, for example. They're all public documents. Now, this is a country that has not yet evidenced respect or tolerance, except on a superficial basis, leaving visitors imagining that Emiratis are some of the most welcoming and hospitable people on earth. But however, foreign investment is fair play, and Emiratis will welcome it in, invite investors to their wedding and their events, but will they actually let the investment leave the country? In many instances, no.
This notion of tolerance is something intrinsic of our culture in the United Arab Emirates, and the presence here and the visit of His Holiness the Pope to this region and specifically to United Arab Emirates.
And exactly just how tolerant is the UAE? And this is a country torn between progressive Western ideas and traditional tribal culture. There's a struggle taking place that keeps the country in a sort of contradictory existence. We see a country where homosexuality is still punishable by death, yet Ricky Martin performs in concert.
It's going to be amazing. Emirates Airlines Jazz Festival in Dubai. First concert. You got to do it. You got to come with us. Let's have fun. You're going to love it.
So we have hordes of celebrities promoting a country that totally contradicts their values, in a country where Ricky Martin could be executed for his own life choices. It's difficult to resonate the reasons why so many celebrities who vocalise their liberal views in America are promoting a country where male guardianship still exists and homosexuals are still persecuted. Celebrity support adds to the confusion and contradiction that the UAE seems to thrive on. On America's most listened to show, I spoke with Sean Hannity about this very issue.
You know, I know that everyone has a conception about Dubai, but there really are a lot of misconceptions about Dubai and the UAE. I really do think, I don't know many other people that are broadcasters in America that have taken on the issue of life for women and gays and lesbians and Christians and Jews in some of these countries that practice Sharia. And the reality is, Radha, is that when you look at their laws and you look at the reality, it's very different than, say, the perceptions that they want to project to the rest of the world. Isn't that true?
Well, certainly. On the one hand, the ambassador of the UAE, Sheikh Mohammed, and the Dubai Media Office is promoting the UAE as the Las Vegas of the Middle East. But this case, and all of the cases really that we've dealt with over the past 10 years, illustrate that it's far from the Las Vegas of the Middle East. In fact, it's more like Saudi. But this perception and the fact that they're using celebrities to market it, American celebrities to market the country back to American citizens, is creating
so they're this is important. They're paying really for the top talent, singers, actors, celebrities. They're paying them massive amounts of money to go to Dubai, marketing it like it's, you know, the brand new Vegas or the Vegas of the Middle East, if you will, when in reality, would it be a fair statement to say that women are abused on a regular basis?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely fair statement to make. And we get inquiries all the time from women saying they're in captivity, they can't leave the country, their husband's confiscated their passport, they can't get it back, they can't get justice, their children are taken away. You know, whatever it happens to be, there is a lot of abuse of women in the country.
Mm-hmm. These celebrities need to be contacted if you hear that they're going. I think one of the best things you could do, find out and tell us and make sure that they're aware of what the conditions are. If nothing, just have a behind-the-scenes call and say, okay, you're getting $1 million for 2 days, but let me tell you what you're not going to see that's really going on in this country behind the scenes, and they're using you to create a false image. Yeah, well, that's why I thought it was wrong for Hillary to take all that money from all those countries that abuse women, gays, lesbians, Christians, and Jews. And I was the only one, I think, in the country that said it again and again and again. And here you have, you know, a woman's life in danger. And you're right, there's a lot of money being poured out there so they can build up, you know, the financial aspects of their country. And meanwhile, people are treated like crap and abused.
Now, Emiratis who seek a sort of democratic reform or another way of non-authoritarian government are jailed as security threats. A great example of that is Ahmed Mansour, who's an Emirati lawyer. He's still in prison. Journalists who don't act as propaganda agents of the government, they're threatened, they're jailed, or they're expelled from the country. There are strict anti-free speech laws that can see foreigners jailed for the slightest step out of line. And even speaking of the notorious escape and kidnapping of Princess Latifah was punishable by lengthy incarceration, huge fines and deportation, despite being a case that was all over the world's international media, all over social media. And yet, within the UAE, people were frightened to talk about it in public at cafes. They would have to whisper about it behind closed doors or face prosecution. Yet we have universities and literary groups who advocate free speech, hosting events and opening campuses in the Emirates, where in fact putting their students and teachers at risk of being arrested for their very opinions, their actions on social media, for discussing something that could possibly offend the regime. Now, one parent was actually arrested for writing a bad review of a secondary college in Dubai. Imagine that. Now, the UAE welcomes trade, business and investment, but does not welcome its withdrawal. Seems entitled to keep it once it's there. They don't want to let it go. Jailing businessmen with such habituality that we can safely say the country has stolen billions of dollars of foreign investment. I've already spoken with Israel's news publication Haaretz about some of the risks that Israelis face when entering the Emirati world, but by no means did we cover all of the potential risks. The deal with Israel, a democratic country, will help whitewash the UAE, giving it sort of legitimacy to further violate human rights. Now, the UAE gains more than Israel because the agreement frames it as an advanced country, where in practice it's more similar to Saudi Arabia. Inevitably, the Israeli media will be inundated with cases of legal abuse, detention without charge, unfair trials, theft of business and funds, as well as more severe human rights violations. And this is the cycle that the Western media has been through over the past decade or two. The UAE didn't change its ways for Britain, didn't change its ways for the United States. And it would definitely be naive to think that it'll change overnight for the Israeli market. A full knowledge of local laws and customs will not protect Israelis from abuse. For the abuse occurs outside of the letter of the law, and being a law-abiding citizen has not protected the Brits and the Americans, and will indeed not protect Israelis either. While I personally commend the normalisation of relations, I think it's a great positive step, a wonderful step towards peace in the Middle East, it must not come at the cost of safety, security and human rights of our citizens residing in or visiting the UAE. Now, as an organisation, we help and advise governments, investors, companies and individuals in advance of any issues they may experience to help mitigate their potential risks. But we also act as crisis managers, first responders in litigious or criminal matters. Thank you for listening to today's Gulf Injustice podcast. We'll be covering the Israel-UAE advances and hope to see some positive change in the region in the coming years.
Thank you for listening to the Gulf Injustice podcast.